Ray Rice is fighting back. He's expected to appeal his indefinite suspension from the NFL. Both ESPN and ProFootball.com are citing multiple league sources that the appeal will happen soon. Rice has until midnight tomorrow to file an appeal. CNN has reached out to Rice's lawyers, but so far no response. The man in the hot seat along with Rice, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, was a no-show at Sunday night's 49ers game. It was the first home game at the team's brand new billion-dollar stadium. The pressure for Goodell to step aside from the commissioner's post continues to build, too. At several games over the weekend, the women's rights group Ultraviolet flew banners with the hashtag Goodell must go. A banner will also be flown over tonight's game between the Indianapolis Colts and the Philadelphia Eagles. Then there is Minnesota Vikings running back Adrian Peterson, who is facing serious child abuse charges, felony child abuse charges. He was forced to sit out Sunday's game after police say he beat his 4-year-old son so badly it left welts and even drew blood. Those facts aren't stopping some fans from pledging their full support, like this woman who donned a Peterson jersey and even carried around a switch pretending to beat people. Peterson even has some big names supporting him, like NBA legend Charles Barkley, who blames some of the outrage on cultural differences.
I'm from the South. I understand boomers' rage and anger, but I think, listen, we have to accept we were born in, he's a white guy, I'm a black guy. I don't know where he's from. I'm from the South. Whipping is, we do that all the time. Every black parent in the South is going to be in jail under those circumstances. I think we have to be careful letting people they dictate how they treat their children.
It doesn't matter where you're from. Right is right and wrong is wrong. It doesn't matter where you're from.
I don't believe that because, listen, we spank kids in the South. I think the question about did Adrian Peterson go overboard? But listen, Jim, we all grow up in different environments.
Now he's talking about Adrian Peterson supposedly, according to police, used a switch to hit his 4-year-old child, leaving marks behind and bruises. He used that switch with the child's pants pulled down and left marks all over the lower part of that child's body. That's according to CBS Houston and police. So let's talk about this. Let's bring in Marc, Lamont Hill, LZ Granderson, and Rachel Nichols. Welcome to all of you. So, LZ, I want to start with you.
Carol.
This is not a black-white issue. I mean, police allege Adrian Peterson beat this child and left welts on his body.
Yes, and, Charles Barkley isn't necessarily describing the differences or the nuance of this story in the most eloquent of ways, but I agree with what he's trying to say, which is this is a significant cultural thing. And if you look at the polling, you will find that the Americans agree with Charles Barkley. In the South, significantly more Southern Americans support spanking your child versus those in the North. There's also an educational barrier. Those who have a college education tend to view spanking as bad. Those who do not have a college education tend to agree with spanking your child as a form of discipline. So the conversation about Adrian Peterson is so much more than an NFL player. It is about this information getting out there and the science that has proven that spanking your child does not produce the desired results. But that information is not out there, and the country is very divided on this topic of spanking children.
Marc, weigh in.
Well, I mean, I think there are some debates about whether or not limited types of spanking do have effects, does have a positive effect. There are very limited ages, I think ages 2 to 6, where very rarely it can be implemented for behavioral correction and does have some benefit. In general, the evidence would suggest that spanking doesn't have the type of impact we want. The data is very mixed. Oftentimes we lump in really harsh forms of corporal punishment.
We're not talking about spanking.
This isn't spanking. Let's just agree. This isn't spanking that we're talking about here.
Well, that's the point I'm trying to make. That's what I was going to say, is that there's a difference between harsh forms of corporal punishment, which have negative impacts, which is what we saw with Adrian Peterson. That's not a spanking, versus what we see when a parent uses an open hand on a child who has his or her clothes on. You spank them 3 times and you give them a lesson, and et cetera, et cetera. That's a very different thing, and the juries are out on that. But I think the idea that this is a cultural and racial thing is important to think about, because there is a cultural and racial dimension.
I don't know that it is, because Rachel, please outline what exactly Adrian Peterson is alleged to have done.
Yeah, and look, one thing I think that's important to note in this this context is the statute in Texas talks about whether the child was beaten beyond the or disciplined beyond the community standard. And that's an interesting notion, right? What is the community standard? It's what Charles Barkley is talking about. And that community standard, we hope, evolves over time, right? It's not the same 100 years ago or 50 years ago as it is today. So the hope is that this case will possibly change the community standard slightly, because what happened in this case, allegedly, is that Adrian Peterson was disciplining his son, who he says was actually who's 4 years old, who he says was getting into a fight with his 5-year-old child. So he was trying to make sure that the kids didn't hurt each other, and that he was disciplining his son, and that he used a switch, he called it, a tree branch with the leaves taken off, to take the child's pants down and whack him. And he intended, he said, to whack him on the bottom. The doctor involved found bruising and open cuts a few days later, even on the child's buttocks, legs, thighs, on his scrotum. And there's reports in the police report of Adrian texting the mother of his child saying, "Hey, I didn't realize that this was going to hurt him as much as it did." It's pretty clear from the chain of events that this wasn't an intentional beating. He wasn't trying to injure his child, but that doesn't mean he didn't, and it doesn't mean that it is okay.
So that's what I'm talking about, LZ. When you call this cultural, this isn't cultural, because this isn't a spanking. He's alleged to have done so much more than that.
Right. My point is that if you were to take an informal poll, particularly of people who have Southern experiences, and tell them if they've ever been disciplined with a switch to the point in which blood was drawn, you will find a great deal of Americans will tell you yes. You will even find that a great deal of Americans will look back on those memories with a sick form of fondness to it, joking about having to go out and pick their own switches and things of that nature. I mean, that's the kind of nuances we need to be talking about. It's one thing to look at the research and look at these pictures and go, this is terrible, blah, 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 and anyone who does it is a child abuser. That may be true in the end game, but to get the nation to that point, you have to understand where the vast majority of Americans, particularly those in the South, are with regards to spankings, even spankings to that level of degree.
And one thing to keep in mind, guys, though, is that Adrian Peterson is a professional football player, okay? He's 6'1". He's 217 pounds of all muscle. And you have to keep that perspective when you think about this 4-year-old child.
But I don't think that's the point, though. With all due respect, I don't think that's the point. I think that's a straw man. I mean, I haven't met anyone, even people who are advocates of this, who are saying that Adrian Peterson did the right thing. I think we all agree that what he did was excessive. Even if you believe in spanking, that's wrong. The question of culture isn't used in an exculpatory fashion. In other words, I'm not saying that you appeal to culture to say it's right. All kinds of stuff happens terribly in the name of culture. Female genital mutilation happens in the name of culture. Stoning happens in the name of culture. Child brides happen in the name of culture. I'm not saying that culture is a defense, but what I am saying is that culture gives us insight into where he's coming from and how we can correct it. If we don't look at culture and we don't look at this as a cultural ritual, then what happens is we look at Adrian Peterson as some outlier, as some weird sociopath who goes around terrorizing 4-year-olds, as opposed to a parent who used a measure that is very common that we might want to change, but that is deeply entrenched into his own culture.
Okay, I got to end it there, but I could talk about this all day. LZ Granderson, Rachel Nichols, Marc Lamont Hill, thanks to all of you. I'll be right back.